Good morning.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining, and thank you, Isabel, for offering this presentation.
Put things in the chat, any kind of observation, any kind of thoughts, while I'm going to start sharing here my screen with you. And I'll make sure I have the chat open somewhere, and I'll go in the slideshow in the proper slide here. And if you want to unmute yourself and talk about it, you can do that as well. It is totally up to you. Let me go on the beginning first. Let me see. Significant result. Yeah, that's exactly. So you report the significant results. And really, I mean, based on what your study question is, you're really going to report the results of the study. So even if you have insignificant results, they should be reported for completion's sake as well. But you definitely want to highlight and start up with a significant result, or with the result that you'll have something to tell your reader about. And I think there's been a lot of discussion in some fora I've been part of and in some groups where a lot of medical researchers in particular say, gee, I wish papers would be published even when the results don't necessarily meet the expectation, or they're not the ones that researchers were hoping to have, because I think it would have a more honest view of scientific research. That's a question to be debated, but ultimately, the results section is really focused on the results that you've received based on the methods you've presented in the previous section, right? That you've described to your readers. So, what did you find? Findings of the study in the results section, absolutely. And it's really important that in most journals, in the results section, you only present the results without any analysis of what the results mean, right? And that's sometimes really difficult to differentiate, because it's natural, especially for you, since this is your work, to think about, this is the result, here is what it means. But what it means really goes in the discussion section. And that differentiation is very important in most scholarly and most scientific journals, to really separate that process and to really, I think, just present the reader with some level of objective reporting of results without offering some analysis or quote unquote interpretation. So that is really sort of a key element of the results section. Nobody said something about tables or figures, really important, right? There is not a results section where we don't have tables or figures. We'll talk about this, and I'm not going to re-talk too much about effective ways of presenting tables and figures, because that is, first of all, not really my area of expertise. But I do have some resources for that, and if I don't have them included on this PowerPoint, I'll put them on the Moodle platform. Some general, there's a lot of material that I've given this to my students in my research in a publishing class. If they have a lot of figures and tables, they can go to those sites. Okay, so let's get started with the more formal slides here, and I'm trying to figure out how I can manage my one. I'm so used to two screens, so I'm like, oh, only one screen. So I'm a little bit spoiled, I guess, with two screens at home. So I just want to revisit this briefly, because just to give us a frame for what we're talking about, the IMRAD structure, which is introduction, methods, results, and discussion. Of course, there's an abstract, but that's usually not included in the four acronyms, but it's there, and we'll talk about that later in another session. It follows this hourglass structure. And so we are right now, where are my annotation tools? Here we are right now in this section, right in the middle, in an hourglass where the sand kind of goes through, like those old hourglasses. I used to have them when I would brush my teeth as a kid, like for 2 minutes. Anyway, that's my memory. That's my association, like a 2-minute hourglass. So we're right here in the middle, where it's the narrowest, because the methods and results sections really are the most focused, narrowest parts of our work, where we're very specific about what we're doing rather than how it connects with larger conversations in the field, in the discipline, impact on the world, whatever it is that we're trying to say. Those are things reserved for the intro section and then the discussion section, right? So we have intro here, methods, excuse my crazy writing with my mouse, methods and results, and discussion section sort of, starting here and then getting broader, and the intro. And we'll talk about these in great detail in the preceding and in following sessions. So having said all this, I'm going to actually skip ahead and clear my drawings here. I'm going to go out of presentation mode for a sec, because I want to fast forward, so to speak, to the results slides. Here we go. So the results section is, it's the terminology that's used for in almost all journals I have seen. I rarely see this called somewhere else, something else. If anybody has seen something else, put it in the chat. There's always an exception to the rule, right? Or many exceptions. And the structure of introduction, methods, results, discussion is the most common and most widely used by most scientific researchers. And of course, there are tons of exceptions. There are now some journals where you actually, I've seen introduction, results, discussion, and methods at the very end, which is interesting, and really you have to switch around your writing, kind of how you present things a little bit. There's always, especially in this day and age with technology, results sections might be shorter in the actual printed version or the printed version accessible online, and there might be supplemental materials to results. A lot of journals these days ask, and we've talked about this with this group, ask researchers to submit their entire data set. So things are also changing around this, because that wasn't the norm 5-10 years ago, really, that you would submit your entire data set. That's something that technology, I think, has made available to us, that we can share things more widely in supplemental sections through online media. So just keep that in mind. But what goes in the results section is, again, fairly straightforward, but it doesn't make it necessarily, simple. It is very complex and an extremely important section of your paper, right? And you have to follow certain guidelines depending on the kind of study you have about things that need to go into the results section. I'll show you some of these guidances a little bit later on. I think somebody mentioned them a couple of weeks ago as well. They're useful for the method section, but they're also useful for the results section. So I think this is what I'm going to talk to you about now, is kind of a suggestion on how to approach writing the results section, which I have heard a lot of colleagues I've worked with from medical research and social science research has worked for them and their teams really well. So you've probably, at this point, you would have written your method section, or at least sketched it out, have a draft, because you've already done your methods. So don't waste your time by not writing it down. Write them down as you did your study. Write down what you did. You can always go back and wordsmith it later and edit it, but you want to have a solid draft of that. And then as you're carrying out your research, you're analyzing your data, you're either in the lab, you're with a computer program, whatever you're doing, statistical research, qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods, and so on. You'll be doing your analyzing and you'll have your results. And as you're looking at your results, or you're kind of looking at, okay, what is it here? I think it's a really useful idea, and one, again, that lots of folks do, is to think about preparing tables and figures first. So for many of you, that first table will have some demographic data. That's pretty common, a lot of research with, with people, right? Where you have like, who is your sample? And this can depend, the depth of that depends on the way you set up your study, but also on what you have to report, gender, age, and so on, geographical region, race, ethnicity, depending on what context you're writing. It's a really important category in the United States, to know what race, ethnicity your participants identify with, if that's something that you've collected. So, and then of course, tables based on, if you have, thinking of some qualitative studies I've worked with lately, sort of analysis, some grounded theory-based analysis of interview data or focus group data. You kind of report the kind of categories you developed. So, and the report on the different categories you developed. So again, the results section is really driven by your research design and by the things you're trying to find out, right? Obviously, but thinking about what kind of tables and figures you want to have in there, and that the journal you're publishing in typically asks or other authors have used in similar studies. That's a really good first start to start writing your results section, even though technically you're not writing the paragraphs, but you're writing and putting together your tables and figures, because they can really drive the way you structure your results section, right? And so working on those, thinking those through first is a really good first step. It also, I have found, and this has worked for me, and when I work with folks on articles as a co-author, where we had some complex data in terms of tables and figures, a lot of my work doesn't, when I write about writing pedagogy, doesn't really require a lot of tables and figures, which is a blessing, I guess, or it is what it is. But when I've worked with folks in these settings, it was a really useful tool to have for us as a group to discuss, okay, So we have the results here. What's the big picture? What are some major trends? What relationships are evident? Tables and figures can really help you discern those main points in a way that if you don't have them, it might just be a little bit more laborious, more labor, might be more work to do that. So tables and figures can be a really helpful first step in writing your results section. And then ultimately, right, the goal of the results section is to summarize what the data show, not analyze, not interpret, not kind of tell people this is what it means in the grand scheme of things. That comes later and is actually, I find, a really tough thing to do. So the discussion section for me personally is always the hardest to write because it requires a lot of intellectual finesse to do that. The results section can do that as well because it's a precursor, if you want to, if you could use it that way. It's like it's a first step towards the discussion section, but it is straightforward because you summarize what the data show, right? And if you have a lot of data, you might have a lot to summarize. And what is important with that interplay between tables and figures, because sometimes I see authors like they prepare these beautiful tables and figures, and then they write like paragraphs and paragraphs of what they have in the tables and figures. I'm like, no, tables and figures are really meant for readers to go to for more information, and you kind of want to highlight the main things from tables and figures, but not recreate the wheel. So you look at tables and figures also as a vehicle for you for your section to kind of put information in there that you might not be able, that you don't have to write about in great detail. Henry, is your microphone on? Do you want to say something? I saw a little screen around your name.
Do I want this? Am I muted?
No, I saw like a little, like it looks like your microphone was off. So I just wanted to make sure if you wanted to comment on something.
No, not right now.
Very good.
Okay.
Then forget that. So, so the idea is with tables and figures to let readers themselves go to tables and figures for more details, right? So they're really a vehicle and a helpful tool for you to guide your reader through understanding your data better. And again, if they want, if you're reporting on, thinking of an example of a study that I use a lot in my presentations on this big Taiwanese study on diabetes 2 and the 2 different drugs to manage that type 2 diabetes, and or 3 different drugs. And so they had all the table organized by the 3 different drugs and different effects on who knows what, and the results section really highlighted sort of the highest numbers, the most significant effects, rather than repeating, every drug, how it affected every single possible outcome. That would have been, a 4, 5, 6 page document just to report that, where you really highlight the most significant numbers, right? And I think, Yildiz, you talked about, this is where I think the idea of like you highlight the most significant results, you report all the results, but you highlight the significant results in the results section. So you are, in a way, you're guiding your reader to understand your results the best way possible. All right, so next slides here. This comes from an article from the Journal of Human Reproductive Sciences. So some of the suggestions here are more relevant to those of you who are doing more clinical research rather than more survey, social science-based type of research. But I wanted to include it because it does a nice job in summarizing some of the most important components of the results section that really, some of them apply across the board. And it's a great resource to go to. So the DOI is down there. If you Google it, I think it's an open access text. If it's not, let me know. I'll make the PDF available on Moodle. So you really, you got to make sure you have a sample size with details of exclusion. This really will apply to all of you, right? Because all of you work with sample size populations. Basic characteristics of the sample demographic data, often table 1, right? That's a classical table 1. If you didn't already have a table in the method section, but it's a first table in the results section. And again, main results and tables, figures with brief description, and text without any interpretation. Interpretation, analysis are interchangeable. I use them interchangeably here. The results section should reflect the materials and method section. So don't suddenly start writing about a result that you use the method for you didn't explain in your materials and method section. So there needs to be a very close correlation there. And then secondary results, post-hoc analysis should be given separately depending on the design of your study. And it's written in the past tense. So as you are now writing your proposals, for those of you who still are, and I think lots of you are still working on that, which is great, you're predicting certain results, right? So it's future, we hope to find, we will, we hope to find that this, blah, 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 however you express that. Results section is completely in the past tense. We found this was, and it's just past tense because it has happened. There are some moments where you can use present tense, and that might be to describe the relevance of a certain, well, you don't talk about the relevance of a certain finding in the results section, but I'm trying to think of a good example of a present tense in the results section. When you're describing something that might have some impact on the present tense. We'll look at an example later, and if I see a present tense there, I'll point it out to you. I can't think of an example right now, but it's mostly past tense. Let me go to the next slide. Sorry, I lost my connection here. There we go. So the reporting guidelines I mentioned earlier, these guidelines differ based on study type and to a certain extent. And by the way, if you're hearing some squealing in the background, that's my son downstairs. I don't have a separate room that I can go into here right now. Anyway, long story. So just know that my 3-year-old is a very happy kid this morning with his grandmother and his father. So these guidelines can also, serve as checklists for you. Some even come in a checklist format, and I'll show you. I'm sure you're familiar with these, but just wanted to revisit these so we're all on the same page, and they're really useful. You might have forgotten that these exist. That usually happens to me. Editors and reviewers use these checklists when they evaluate manuscripts, so making sure that you cover those points on there is a good first step towards reducing the commentary by reviewers about not being transparent and detailed enough. That if you use them, it doesn't mean that reviewers will not comment on that. They probably will. It's their job. And whoever reads it might have a different view on what you'll need to include, right? I mean, that's the part of the review process. But using those would at least give you a baseline of things to include and to make sure you cover, so you're in good shape for that first round of comments from the reviewers. And maybe we all get lucky, like Henry did. The editors step in and say, I'm going to take care of it from now on. Wouldn't that be nice? Anyway, so here's one, the consolidated criteria for reporting qualitative research, CORAC. And let me click on that and show you what that looks like. This is from Elsevier. So I really like this list. So it gives you an idea of what needs to be in your manuscript, study design, analysis and findings. So coding tree, blah, blah, blah. And again, this is based on qualitative design, certain type. It's a really useful checklist. I think Elsevier gives this to their reviewers, and so that's why you see reported on page number 1, so reviewers can check this off. I think I've never used anything as when I review, but I review different types of studies usually, so this is not my primary area of expertise for review processes. But again, so there you'll see some of the things that most reviewers will most likely look for when you're using qualitative research design. All right, let me go back to my PowerPoint. There we are. I also have this is for the consort, which most of you should be very familiar with, the consolidated standards of reporting trials, consort for randomized control trials. Let me click on this for you. Here's the consort website. You have a checklist here, you have a flow diagram. Let me click on the checklist briefly. Oh, it's a document. Let me open it up for you. Hold on one second. My Word is taking its time. There we go. So here you have, again, the report on page number. And this is useful even for you to use. Title and abstract, introduction, methods. So introduction is pretty short. Methods, results are a lot more in detail. So again, this is for randomized control trials. So pick and choose which one you need and what will work best for you. Let me close this up and go back to there we go. So these are some of the ones, and there's a link to the checklist, to the flow diagram for the consort reporting guidelines, so you can check those out. And I think there is a general website that I usually have on my reference page. I'll make sure I have it on there. If not here, then I put it on Moodle for you all. So let me talk a little bit about outlining your results section, because that's an important step in, like, okay, so you have all these results, how do you organize them? And then one of my favorite guides for anything around scientific writing or research writing is this series by Thomas Ansley called In Clinical Chemistry. This is the short, and they're short, they're like 2-3 pages long. It's called Show Your Cards, the Results Section in the Poker Game. He always has like funny titles that, good for him. I can never come up with this stuff, or good for them. So Ainsley suggests four major ways you can organize your results. You can organize them by chronological order, depending on the way that you've carried out your methodology and the way you found it. It's a very common way to organize your results section. Some organize them by topic or experiment. This is, I think, useful for more complex studies where you have different sort of subtopics, sub-experiments. Again, for more complex study, that might be the best way to organize it. Some organize it from general to specific, like the broadest result to the most specific result. And a lot of folks, this is one that I see a lot as well, especially then repeated in the discussion section, from the most important result to the least important result. So in there, you kind of already given the reader a guide on like how to understand your results. Again, the chronological order, I think, is the most straightforward, and I don't want to say honest because the others aren't dishonest, but it's the most straightforward one, right? You present it the way you found it. But again, depending on the complexity of your study, some of the other ones might be more useful to use. And what is nice when you start thinking about organizing the way you present your results in the results section, it can actually really help you how you would organize the discussion section, because you can use the same structure. So let's say you use the most to last important, which is a reason why I think many people use that. You will most likely start in your discussion section with the most important finding or the answer to your research question, right? We'll talk about this more when we get in 3 weeks discussion section. But if you already have the structure in the results section, it makes it easier on your reader to understand the flow of the information. So it's an added benefit. If you use a certain structural way to organize your results section, think about how to mimic that in your discussion section. So that it's not necessary, doesn't mean you get more likely to get published, but it does organize the information more coherently for the reader, which always adds to easier reader experience. And reviewers like easy reading experiences. They do, right? They have to read a lot. They do this on their sort of free time. So the easier you make it on them, the better off you are. Let me clear my drawings here. So let's see, I gotta close this up. So there we go. Hold on, there we go. So some more tips I want to share with you on the results section, sort of a combination of some of these things I've talked about before and some of the things that I've seen work well for folks I've worked with. It's always good, just like most sections, apart from the intro maybe, but in methods and results in particular, use subheadings to break the information into smaller parts. It's very, very useful to do this in the results section as well. So, if you can use subheading, sometimes it's hard to use them depending on the nature of your research design. And if that doesn't work, that's fine. It's something that we can talk about as you start preparing your manuscript in individual sessions. If you want me, when I look at your manuscripts from that perspective, I'm happy to give some thoughts on that. But it's something that you can also start discussing with your team, with your research team, or with your co-authors, if you have co-authors, or or with colleagues, if you're thinking about how can you best organize the results section. And this is where the previous slide comes in handy, like the general to specific. When you have these sections, think about using subheadings for that, because it's always easy to digest a lot of information broken down into smaller parts, right? It's a general principle of digestion, even intellectual, mental digestion. When you highlight differences between results, use percentages in the text and absolute numbers in tables, right? So basically, when you're writing about numbers, try to avoid using numerical stuff as much as possible, or use percentages rather than absolute numbers. Absolute numbers sometimes can, like 1,536. Well, tell me more like about 72% or whatever it is. It's easier for a reading mind to comprehend that. If we see too many numbers, it gets very confusing very quickly. So leave those for the tables and figures as much as possible. So make it descriptive, as descriptive as possible within the text, and then see table 1, figure 2, whatever, for more details. Right? That's usually what happens. And I'm sure you've seen this in many of the texts you've either read or you've done this yourself in your previously published work. Highlight, repeat the most important numbers. Again, no need to repeat all the numbers, all the results, all the detail. Use the ones that will help you, again, set you up also for the discussion section. So these are really the results you'll discuss in greater detail in the discussion section to make sense for your reader what they actually mean. If you have negative control results, of course, you want to include them. I mean, that's just a good research design kind of perspective as well. Just want to put this out there. And this is sort of a little thing that I sometimes find, even native English speakers sometimes do this, but particularly I think for those of you for whom English is not the first language, use significant only in this section when you describe statistically significant results, right? It's confusing for readers to read something about significance and it not be tied to statistically significant. And I've seen reviewers actually really be extremely critical, be very critical about that in their review process when that happens. Okay, I don't know if you hear the wailing in the background. My kid has decided not to be happy right now. Sorry about the noise. I'm wearing a headphone, so hopefully it minimizes some of that. The beauty of children. Anything why you did something, like any justification why you use a certain methods, method section, not results. Like sometimes these things slip up because somehow the differentiation between methods and results isn't always the most natural. It's just the way that we do it. So think about that. Let me see, there's a question in the chat. Asma, what do you want me to elaborate on what point? I'd be happy to, I just don't know which point because I make so many.
Yes, use significant only when describe significant.
Yes, so you don't want to say something like, oh, our study is significant or this result, this is a significant result. You don't want to use that language. So use like this, so like this is significant and you attach a p-value to it, right? So you have to report if it's statistically significant. Then use, otherwise you can say important, meaningful, and usually that would come in the discussion section more likely anyways. So when in the results section, when you use the term, literally the term significant, it should refer to a statistically significant result. And ideally you want to say statistically significant rather than just significant. Does that make sense, Asma?
Thank you.
Yeah, it's such a, yeah, you're welcome. It's such a term that's reserved for statistics. We see it and we think of statistically significant. So readers feel misled if you use it, especially in this section, or honestly throughout probably your research paper. So if you want to say something about something being important, but not it's not referring to statistically significant things, use important or meaningful. Don't use the term significant, even though that's what it means. But in the research world, that term is loaded in a sense, right? Great question. So why you did something in method section, let me see if I have something else on here. There we go. And I want to say this again, I said this before, anything, what the results mean, any analysis, interpretation goes into the discussion section. And this applies to, I don't want to put a number on it, but if I had to, I want to say 95 to 98% of all biomedical social science journals. Now there are journals, and I actually in my course that I teach, we go into a whole discussion board around, what is, because there are some researchers who are pushing back on this, who are saying it is illogical to remove the results from what they mean. Like if I report on the results, I should also report on what it means right away. And I kind of get that, but that is the common way that most research articles have, in the past, I want to say 30, 40 years, have been structured this way. There are some computer science journals I've seen where the results and discussions are mixed. I've also seen some journals recently, and you will notice from the journal guidelines that put results and discussion into one section, so they just combine them. And so usually the guideline for the authors is report on your result and then talk about the meaning of it right after in the next paragraph. So you're kind of mixing results and discussion section literally into one section. But those are more the exception than the norm. But if you're selecting a journal that asks for that, we can certainly then work around how do you write that more effectively. There isn't really, I think we're so used to separating these that it feels natural. But if you think from a logical point of view, it's a kind of a little bit unnatural, actually. But alas, that is the way that, we're most research is reported in most journals, in most science and academic fields. So again, the differentiation, and we will, when we work with you on your manuscripts, it's really easy to see from reader's perspective when you start going into the analysis in your results section. And if we see this, we'll point it out to you. So don't be like, oh my God, I hope I don't mix it up. If you mix it up, no worries, we'll detect it, right? And we definitely will. And sometimes there is sort of a gray area, like, is this really already analysis or just reporting? And so then we'll just have to kind of figure out the best way to move forward. So you're not doing this on your own. Nobody will ever look at this. We will be involved in this. So, I certainly will, and your faculty mentors, your content mentors as well. And I'm sure Henry will also be involved in a lot of this process. So I want to show some examples, and I'm a little, I'm going to go out of the presentation mode here for a second. Okay, 8:39, because I don't have a clock in front of me, which was not the smartest choice on my part. I want to show you some examples of subheadings. So this comes from a study from BMC Medical Ethics, a survey-based study on physicians in Ethiopia around clinical ethical dilemmas in a low-income setting. It's a 2019 study, and I want to point out the sheer amount of subheadings for the results section. I mean, these are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 12 subheadings, 12 subsections in the results section. And that is because if you look at the last 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, they're all about different dilemmas, right? Dilemmas. So they're really, and it's a survey-based study, and it's not unusual to have a lot of subheadings in survey-based studies for your results, because you have a lot of qualitative data. And somehow actually the way that you organize the data for your reader is by creating smaller pieces of the large survey data that you have. So if you're doing survey-based research, I really want to encourage you to start thinking as you are collecting your data, analyzing it, and think about the way you want to present that and organize it for readers in your results section. It's really, really helpful, because otherwise it's just like, oh my God, it's so much material, right? So it is a lot of detail here around different subsections in the results sections. Let me see the other ones. So let me show you an article that's more clinical based, or that's, not clinical, it's not a clinical study, it's an environmental study, but it's based on lab data, right? Collected data analyzed in the lab. You have 3 subheadings in the results section. And I think that's pretty common for mostly quantitative analysis. There's also quantitative studies that have a lot of subheadings, but I think as a general trend, qualitative or mixed method studies tend to have more subheadings in their results section. Of course, there's probably 40,000 examples that will negate that point. It depends on the complexity of your study ultimately. But I think for qualitative work with surveys and focus groups, organizing the information as subheadings in your results section is really important. Whereas here, you have 3 subheadings. This was about the coagulase negative staphylococci, or cons carriage in water. You have 3 areas, 3 result areas in the results section. Right, so a little bit more straightforward. I do want to share this flow diagram for those of you who were in this presentation 3 weeks ago. I used this flow diagram also as an example that you can use in your method section. In your method section, you would use this flow diagram for larger clinical studies, or even for larger survey-based studies, to describe a little bit the methodology, how you selected patients from like 1.5 million, you dwindle it down to 500,000, and how you organize them into the different groups. This is a study I mentioned earlier about diabetes 2, the different drugs and so on. So right, this is a great vehicle to shorten your writing in your method section, describing how you developed how you kind of funnel your participants. But it can also be useful in a results section if you're focusing on some of the results to it. So here, this one here is used. This was figure 1 in the method section. This comes from the method section, right? But flow diagrams, I've worked with some folks who'd like to put flow diagrams into their results section and use that to identify the results. So that's another option. You can use a flow diagram if you have a large, if you want to use it that way. Let me see, clear my drawings. Here we go. Let me go to the next one. I mentioned the summarizing. This is the example that's on your handout as well, because the text is a little bit small. But you'll see here, this comes again from the study in Ethiopia, the survey study. You'll see table 1, respondent characteristics, right? So you see here women, men. Let me highlight this: women, men, number, who answered the question, 1 to years in practice, because this was about, I think they asked physicians, so how many years in practice were these physicians, average number of patients per week. So, if are there specialists, professional status and so on. And so if you would put all of this information in Word, in a paragraph, you would have several paragraphs to do this. So what the authors are doing here, so of the 640 practitioners to whom questionnaires were distributed, so and so many responded, respond rate 91.7. Personally, I wouldn't have put this number here. I would have just put the percentage, but at least I put the percentage here, because percentages are easier to understand more quickly, like what's the relationship between this number and this number. So I would have maybe said out of the 640, so many percentage responded, and then the respond rate here was 91.7. Questionnaires from physicians with less than 1 year of service were excluded. So here they report most respondents were male and young and had less than 6 years. Half of them were general practitioners. So here there's some detail in these sections right here that I highlighted for you right here. Some detail that comes from the study, but it's not all of it, right? So you really want to, so table 1, and you could have put in here, see table 1 for more details. So they're really sort of highlighting what is the largest group that participated. So 38% worked in private clinics, many had long working hours. So what are the most common characteristics of this sample of 587 people who responded? What are their main characteristics? They're predominantly male, they're predominantly younger, they have less than 6 years, blah, 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 right? Rather than saying, oh, we had 8 people who had 21 more years. And then that's right. You really focus on the largest numbers within each of these, that's what you're describing rather than all the detail. But the detail you'll include in the table. That's what I meant earlier by the tables and figures are useful to present all of your data or a good overview, but you're actually only writing about the most significant numbers. And in this, I shouldn't say significant, sorry, the most important numbers, because we're not talking about statistical stuff here. The most important, meaningful numbers for your readers to understand what are the major characteristics of your sample. All right, clear my drawings here. There we go. Before I go into questions, comments, I also want to, and I'm going to go out of screen sharing here right now. I'm going to put and I'm going to go back into it. I want to put a sample paper, and it's one that Henry was the corresponding author on, for us to look at as an example. So give me a second and let me find that study. There it is. You should see the PDF. So open the PDF and just look at the results section. And I'm going to put it up on my screen as well. So let me open it on my screen and try to start screen sharing here in a sec again. There we go. So you should be looking at this study here. I'm trying to make this as large as possible so you can see it. And I'm going to scroll down to the results section. So take a look at the results section and tell me what you see. Don't spend too much time reading all the detail. Just sort of kind of look at it like, okay, what is reported initially? What kind of tables and figures? Are there any subheadings? And if you want to unmute yourself or just put any observations in the chat, please do so. I'll give you a moment to do this.
I just want to let everyone know that I have thick skin, so all comments are welcome.
It was published, so right? So I was like,
Right,
sure,
yeah,
you can critique all you want.
I was just gonna say, it was published, but no, seriously, uh, any helpful comments? Don't be shy.
So right here, this table 1 again. Anyway, go ahead. Whoever wants to put it in the put something in the chat, talk. I know you're still taking some time to look through it, so no rush. We have another 12 minutes here, so. I'm going to scroll myself through this a little bit. I haven't looked at this paper in a while.
How many subheadings are there?
I know, I was just looking the same thing. I think there's one, prevalence of self-reporting, report and knowledge of colleagues, blah, blah, blah. I think it's only 2, Henry.
Oh,
Attitudes regarding certain issues. Yeah, two subheadings.
right, yeah. I've taken the method, not method, of having a subheading, participants' characteristics. Just to, I don't want to overload the results section with subheadings, but I think it's nice to make that differentiation.
Yeah. What I've noticed as I was reading, and that's actually a really great way to also start thinking about organizing a results section. What the authors here are doing, and Henry being one of them, they use a lot of the paragraphs start with like table 3 shows, table 4 shows. So they're using the tables to structure the results section, which is actually a really great way of doing that as well. So that's another possibility, right? You use the tables to organize your paragraphs and subsections within your results section. You provide some detail about from the tables, and then the tables themselves.
Also point out the active voice.
That's true, shows the. Oh, this is where I'm actually glad. This is, remember I said earlier, present tense versus past tense. So here, table 3 shows is obviously the present tense because it continues to show. So you wouldn't write table showed, but it shows. So, but the misconduct composite in which the last was noted, right? Whatever relates to the actual results is the past tense. But anything to like organizing stuff like table 3 shows and so on, that's an example of present tense. And yes, Henry always does a nice job with active voice in his writing, I have to say. There's a question. Past tense used properly. That's right, Asma. Good job, Henry. You get a brownie point. Brownie points are things, I guess, I don't know. I don't even know exactly what the origin of the term is, but I think it's what you get in elementary school. You get a brownie is an American dessert, like a very rich chocolate kind of bar cake thing. And so brownie point is something when you've done something well. So I look up the explanation of it and put it later on in the chat or something. So for those of you who want to know a little bit more about what brownie points mean, but it's like a gold star. Good job. Anything else? So here you have a typical. I do notice, Henry, that you provide actually a lot of detail from the tables in your paragraphs. Like table 3, for example, you almost provide all of the detail that's in table, not all of it, but a lot of it. And, you know, and that might be necessary. And it's, I think I see this a lot more in qualitative studies based on surveys, where you really, you know, to get that rich explanation, that rich context, you might need to do that. So that balance is something that can change depending on, you know, the kind of design you're using, study design you're using, and the kind of, you know, thinking about what do your readers most benefit from.
Also, I want to point out, scroll down. I'm not gonna, scroll up, scroll up.
Got it.
Where you were before.
For table 3 or for?
I don't know, I can't remember. Maybe table 3.
All right, that's where I was before. I'll go there. 1 second. Yeah.
Going too fast to me. What I don't merely repeat the data. I try to, if you will, not interpret the data, but give it some meaning. So, like I had there that fabrication and falsification was the most frequent research misconduct practice, followed by blah, blah, blah. So I want to point out the major findings, which may have some implication for the discussion section.
I was about to say that, Henry. I think that's a really great strategy. Say hi to everybody, to my mother in the background, by the way. She's walking around here. That's okay. That's okay. That's fine. It's fine, Mom. And I think that's a really great setup. So you really, you know, you're all of these sections in the articles really are interrelated to each other. But the results section, you know, I mean, all sections are important, but the result, you don't have a discussion section without your results. I mean, you didn't have an article without results, obviously. But the results section, the more work you can do in the results section to set up for the discussion section, the easier, you know, from a reader's perspective, it is then to understand what your discussion section really is trying to say. And it's also going to be easier for you to write your discussion section, because writing a discussion section, figuring out what is important, what does it mean, and you know, you have to this, and we'll talk about this again in 3 weeks. There's so much going on in the discussion section. It can be overwhelming, and it's the part where I see most research writers sort of tear their hair out, like the discussion section. You know, everything else is like a, you know, easier compared to that. So when you're setting this up this way, that the way Henry describes it, so you're not really giving the meaning, but you're setting up the reader to understand the meaning later on, and especially set yourself up to understand, you know, to write about the significance of these categories in that way is really, really helpful. There's something in the chat. Let me check. Should write P 0.03 instead of writing P. Okay, the paragraphs, that's what the table shows. There you go, Henry. Pierre has a...
It was less than 0.003.
There you go, right here.
So what could I say? Figures a statistician would call me or point that out, but well noted.
Yeah. Any other observations, thoughts, any other questions about the results section? Because we're at 8:50. Well, it's 3 minutes to the full hour. And I forgot to say earlier, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. I had actually a colleague of mine dial into a meeting we had the other day from Japan at like 2 o'clock in the morning. So I don't know what to say. Good middle of the night. I hope nobody is at 2 a.m. in the morning, but if you are, kudos to you. Any other questions, thoughts, comments on this? You have a couple more minutes. We can discuss a little bit, or if anything, and for those of you who are currently writing their protocols, or still are revising their protocols, the results section is something that you obviously can't work on until you get, your results and carry out the study. But, these kind of guidelines and these kinds of, thinking about it, even as you're carrying out the research, can really help set you up for a slightly smoother writing experience, because writing is never easy. Right? It's a difficult process because there's so much going on intellectually in our minds. But this at least gives it some structure. And I did want to point out, I wanted to show, I think I put let me go back to screen share one quick second. Here we go. I'm going to show you the last slide here. And this is the, if you want to read, if there's two things I would suggest to read those two articles here by Ainsley. I'm going to click on one of them. They're open access, skip verification. I don't know why this is where I'm connecting to the server or whatever. This is a PDF. This is about the method section. You see, it's like three, okay, it's 4 pages long, but it's a really easy read. There's some great examples in there. There's, all passive voice, all active voice, combined passive aggressive for method section. The results one is equally short, or, 3-4 pages long. So I, look at those for some additional detail on these two sections. Save them somewhere. They're really, really useful. The other ones are very useful as well. The author aid stuff is fantastic. Some great PowerPoint presentations on IMRAD. I've used them in my preparation for all of my workshops. And there's something here that I mentioned from Springer on figures and tables and editage that I suggest to you for looking at a little bit more, like carefully for preparing figures and tables. And if you want some more about passive and active voice, there's a great resource by the Duke University's Graduate School Scientific Writing resource on passive and active voice in scientific writing. I've been using this a lot in my teaching. So, all right, let me stop sharing.
Let me make 2 short points. One, I didn't do it in this paper, but there's a whole science involved in how to present results. And one point is if there's any way you could use figures, create figures instead of tables, that breaks up the monotony of presenting figures. The other thing, there was a comment about a limit on tables, and I have found that there is no such thing as a limit on tables, because if you have too many tables because you have too many data, you submit it as a supplementary file. In this day and age, because of the online medium, you could always take a few, if you have too many tables, just, again, a supplementary file. That's fair game.
Correct. All right, no more questions. Everybody's going to write the most perfect result section. Kidding. There's no perfect result section. It's just what you have. But I'll put some more examples on Moodle in a few weeks. I'm going to be in Canada. I'm in Canada. It's a long story about visa regulation, travel restrictions. My mother can't travel directly from Germany here, so she has to come to Canada for 2 weeks. And so we're vacationing in Canada, and and it's really lovely around here. So we're quite blessed that we can do it. So that's why I'm going to be here for another week and a half. But so if anybody wants some maple syrup, I'll get you some.
Sounds good. One last comment. Now, when you read papers, focus on how the results section is developed or looks, yes. and see what grabs you, and copy that style.
Great suggestion, Henry. Absolutely.
So read with another interest in mind, and that interest is scientific writing, in addition to the content as well.
And if you have any great examples, send them my way. I'll include them in sort of a best of video that I always like to do. Because it's, you never stop learning about how to put things together more effectively. And there's so many different ways to do it. So share with me. I'll be happy. I always love more examples.
Okay, that sounds good. Well, Isabel, thank you. Thank you very much for
My pleasure.
a wonderful presentation. I'll have the recording up soon.